One lesson, I think, for anybody who's aspiring to leadership is recognizing that oftentimes events choose you. You don't choose events. In January of 2009, when I was inaugurated, we were going through the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression, and the financial system had essentially shut down. The first thing to understand is the full context of how the financial crisis came about.
In a way, it starts all the way back in the 1930s. In the Great Depression, the United States creates a whole regulatory structure of rules of the road that are going to apply to financial institutions. But by the 80s and 90s, there was a huge effort to deregulate finance.
The mortgage companies took the simplest thing, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. They made it real short, like you refinance it every 2 years and you have an interest rate that's real low at the beginning called a teaser rate, and then it jumps up and we don't actually find out if people can afford to pay for it.
But it wasn't unique to mortgages, loans for cars or using credit cards. A lot of people were getting systematically taken advantage of.
People borrowed 100% or more of the value of their house in a mortgage, and then the price of housing began to collapse.
Essentially, it was a big house of cards. And what you started seeing in 2007 is that house of cards started to crumble. In a panic, people started pulling back on lending. Suddenly, employers couldn't make payroll. And so you had this compounding failure.
And those things fed on themselves, raising the risks that the economy would fall into a Great Depression and the financial system would collapse.
Our first job was to stop the bleeding and kickstart the economy, which is why we immediately started a stimulus package called the Recovery Act that put people to work, increased demand, provided tax cuts, started major construction projects, helped states with their budgets.
The key thing about the president in this period was his ability to take the long view and recognize that even while the fires of the crisis were burning, we had to put in place a set of reforms and safeguards that would reduce the risk of it happening again.
There were a series of systemic flaws in the financial system and how we regulated it that we had to get fixed. And that was the goal of Dodd-Frank.
My administration is proposing a sweeping overhaul of the financial regulatory system, a transformation on a scale not seen since the reforms that followed the Great Depression.
The big question was what will be in Dodd-Frank?
Yes, it's a Wall Street reform, but it is called the Dodd-Frank Act. Dodd is Senator Chris Dodd, and Frank is Congressman Barney Frank. They were the chairs in Congress that oversaw getting the legislation through Congress and onto the president's desk.
They carried all the burden, really, of trying to reach consensus among the many competing ideas and concerns and preferences in their caucuses.
Elizabeth Warren had this idea for a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and we included that as part of Dodd-Frank.
We had a whole bunch of agencies, each one of which owned like a little piece of protecting consumers. And the consequence was, for no agency was it their first job.
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau will be a watchdog for the American consumer.
The big banks spent a fortune lobbying against Dodd-Frank. They tried everything they could do to convince the folks in Congress, oh, we learned, we won't do it again.
What we've seen so far in recent weeks is an army of industry lobbyists from Wall Street descending on Capitol Hill. If these folks want a fight, it's a fight I'm ready to have.
There were lengthy hearings. There were people from all sides had the opportunity to come and testify.
The president announced Wall Street reform more than a year before the bill ended up on his desk, largely because those that had contributed to the crisis were still resistant to reform. It took the president and it took people pushing hard from both the inside of government and the outside of government to make reform actually happen. And ultimately, the bill that reached the president's desk was 800 pages long and included hundreds of new regulations that reordered the financial system and created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
This was the toughest set of financial regulations since the Great Depression.
Before the CFPB, if people had a dispute with their financial institution and they didn't know what to do about it, and they couldn't afford a lawyer or they couldn't afford legal help, there really was nowhere in our country for them to call directly to get assistance with that issue.
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has already forced the giant financial institutions to return more than $12 billion directly to people they cheated. So the next time you take out a mortgage, the next time you get a credit card, the next time you go to your bank and you've got a checking account or a certificate of deposit and you don't get cheated, just remember, part of the reason is because there's a cop on the beat to make sure everybody's following the rules.
One of the things that I benefited from greatly in managing this crisis was that we had a collection of extraordinarily smart, dedicated people who were willing to make great personal sacrifices and work together. But there's also a broader lesson that I think speaks to our time as much as it did a decade ago, and that is that our work is never finished. Part of the reason that you had a crisis in 2007, 2008 was because there had been underlying trends that had been taking place for decades. Each generation of leadership has to tackle a piece of the problem. That's one of the reasons why at the foundation our focus is on developing the skills and the talent of young people who are working on a whole host of issues, because their work's never done, and hopefully the skills and training and insights that they develop and the experiences they have and the challenges they confront, that will then give them the tools they need not only to succeed but also then pass it on to the next generation, and we keep on handing off the baton, then things get better. Progress happens, and we can look back with pride in terms of what we accomplished.